So since it is 2 o'clock, gosh, for once, we guys will be punctual and get things started. I want to welcome you all here today. This is our monthly webinar presented by the Coalition of Refuge Friends and Advocates, CORFA, and the National Wildlife Refuge Association, NWRA. And today's topic is on beyond diversity, organizational culture and systems of change. And we just felt like this was an extremely important topic, both in terms of growing our organizations and making sure that our organizations continue to exist, and also just based upon some of our own personal experiences in terms of, joining a board and whether or not you feel comfortable as time goes on with that organization. I want to thank Eden Taylor with the Refuge Association being here and handling all the technical issues so that some of us just don't have to. And Marco from Refuge Association is also here. He's going to have a short announcement for us towards the end. And there's a number of the CORFA board here, Cheryl and Lisa, and I'm looking at names and I'm not catching anybody else, but there could very well be. I want to welcome everyone here and thank you so much for taking time this afternoon to join us for this. Our presenter today is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is Ashley Ann Perez Rivera, who is absolutely delightful to work with. And Ashley Ann, I'm going to turn it over to you now so that you can tell folks about yourself and get into the presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. I am really excited to be here today. Welcome and thank you again for joining. I really regret the opportunity or missing the opportunity to meet many of you in person this past April. However, I really appreciate the substantial interest in this session and the chance to engage in a dialogue with you all today. So as Joan mentioned, my name is Ashley Ann Perez Rivera. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently logging in from the lands of the Kumeyaay, historically colonized by European settlers, and it's often referred to as San Diego, California. So Eden, you can go on and share the presentation. So as we discuss systems of oppression today, I want to recognize and call out that these systems are really deeply rooted in settler colonialism. And in our discussions around equity, justice, inclusion, and access, it's important to recognize the genocide and displacement of First Nation people and how it left a legacy of marginalization that continues to exist today. So with this, I acknowledge and I offer gratitude to the Indigenous ancestors and present-day relatives of the lands that I'm currently on. And I'll be sharing a lot of resources after our presentation today related to land acknowledgements, working with tribal partners, as well as justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. One thing I want to confirm before really getting into the meat of the presentation is that this will all be made available to you. And when you see the presentation sent to you, you'll notice that it'll be a couple key differences. Each of the sections will have citations. So that means that they'll have resources. I'd left them out for the presentation because it would be a lot of skipping around. But there will be citations in the form of video, podcasts, academic articles, regular articles that you all can reference back to as you continue to do this work within your organizations. And so, next slide. If you've attended the Friends Academy, oh, someone's not on mute. Sorry. So if you've attended the Friends Academy or the Friends Workshop in the past, you may be familiar with some of the aspects of what I'm going to share. This presentation is actually a little bit different though, because I've taken a lot of what I've learned over the years. And in the past year, I had the chance to explore deeper to understand how organizational culture yields power in ways that prevent us from operationalizing change, doing the actual change that we need to do to make diverse, inclusive, accessible, and equitable teams. So about myself, I work at the refuge system as I shared, or as Joan shared earlier. I have moved around the country at this point many times. So I've lived in many kinds of communities, and I've been talking and thinking about this for a really long time. I went to a predominantly white university, and that really shifted my perspective on systems of change and really started to give me experiences and how to talk about this and how to create change to ensure that we're more inclusive. In college, I spent a lot of time organizing around equity and inclusion and training for tenured staff. And I continue to do that work and embed it in everything that I do because I think it's so important. Next slide. So we're going to use a really fun tool today. Of course, you're also welcome to use the chat, but Mentimeter is a virtual tool that allows me, the presenter, to include polls, open-ended questions, and this just creates more interaction with me so I know what you're thinking. And there are going to be points throughout the presentation where I'm going to ask a question or I'm going to encourage you all to talk with me and be part of this conversation. And so the answers that are provided, the reason why I'm using or I'm providing this specifically is because Mentimeter allows you to answer these questions completely anonymous. So you can use your cell phone or you can open another tab in your browser and type in www.menti.com, enter the code, or you can use the QR code. The main point here that I'm trying to make is that a lot of times fear, shame, and guilt as a result of power dynamics and professional relationships, they prevent us from grappling through the discomfort. So folks like even myself often withhold feelings, questions, comments for fear, like, oh, I don't know what other people are going to think, or is this a dumb question? And so this space is so that you can ask all the questions without fear that someone's going to know that you asked that question. Of course, if you are comfortable enough, or if you don't mind, you can also use the chat. So it's not mandatory to use Menti either. And for the sake of this representation, if you've used Menti before, sometimes it will be embedded in the presentation and it'll show the results. For the sake of our presentation today, I'll be the only one viewing the results, and then I'll publish them in the final presentation. So yeah, really excited. So our first question to kind of get to set the stage today is like, why are you here? Like, what are you hoping to gain from our conversation or dialogue today? You can type it in the chat. You can share with me on Menti. I'm seeing a lot of wanting to learn, raising awareness, want to see more diversity on your team, want to learn more about how EDI relates to refuges. Some of you hire entry-level positions and want to provide the best work environment. And you want information on how friends can engage with new audiences. Cool. So as we continue our conversation today, next slide, sorry, we're gonna talk through a lot of uncomfortable scenarios. And so I think community agreements, sometimes referred to as community guidelines, are important for our conversation so we all know where we stand and what's expected of us. So if you have any specific rules or guidelines or thoughts about how you would like our community to engage in this dialogue today, let me know in the chat, let me know on Menti, because this is the first step to setting the stage for our conversation today. So I'm hearing with respect, what is said here stays here. Assume good intentions, but holding folks accountable for hurtful actions. be open to admit mistakes and learn from them, assuming good intent, and listening as a required behavior. And of course, the freedom to ask those hard questions. So next slide. One of the things that I want to foster here with our conversation today is being curious, being imaginative and being uncomfortable. I had a professor that really emphasized the role that us students had in creating new places and new systems and thinking beyond the status quo. And I think that's really important for these conversations. When we're thinking about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, access, organizational cultures, it can sometimes be difficult to be imaginative, to see that there could be something other than what we currently know. So I want to encourage us to be curious and to be imaginative, but also to be uncomfortable, and sit with that discomfort. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not maybe digging deep enough in this conversation. Being comfortable kind of affirms that you're good, like you're in this around folks that are just like you or have the same perspectives. When you're in a new space, when you're engaging in diverse in challenging conversation, you're supposed to be uncomfortable. And of course, like many of you shared, assume nothing, but except for good intentions. But at the same time, know that your intent, know your intent and own your impact. So sometimes we say things, we ask things, and they have harmful consequences. It's important to understand that while you may have not intended for that to be the case, that is the impact that you had. And of course, I want us to all be aware of time. If you're someone who is like super talkative and maybe make space for someone who doesn't usually engage, but also if you're someone who doesn't usually engage, you're a little quiet, try to be bold, engage as much as you can with our conversation today. Next slide. Excuse me. So in our conversation today, we're first going to address like, what is justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and access as a framework? And we need to understand these as the basis to address and dismantle the barriers to recruitment and retention in our teams. After we talk a little bit about what these concepts are, we're going to be discussing some key facts, some data that has been collected on organizational diversity within the environmental sector. And we're also going to be talking about organizational culture and systems of change and what we can do to shift the diversity and create inclusive spaces on our teams. Next slide. So without understanding what justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access is, it's really difficult to plan, to follow through, measure our impact, or even express our desire to diversify. A lot of the times we have these conversations and we're like, oh, I just want more diverse people on my staff or on my team. And there's no, and oftentimes while it's well-intended, we don't always start off with the same basis of what we mean when we say we want more diversity on their team. So we're gonna go through, next slide, and really define what we mean by diversity. As a general definition, diversity refers to variety. It's the condition of having or being composed of different elements, and an instance of being composed of different elements or qualities. Next slide. A lot of times when we talk about diversity, we're talking about race, ethnicity, gender, age, ability, sexual orientation, and even socioeconomic status. So diversity has been used as an umbrella term to refer to many of these different identities. Next slide. But often what we miss is that there are so many ways to measure or think about diversity. And so it's more than just the tip of the iceberg, but the tip of the iceberg is also a big part of why we talk about diversity. So it's important to be aware of of the single story. Next slide. A lot of the conversations we had, like I've had with friends groups and colleagues, and even outside of the Fish and Wildlife Service and my career and in my personal life, sometimes I hear like, oh, there's no diversity in my community. Everyone kind of looks like me, and this is the barrier. Like, that's why we don't have to focus on it. And so if you've ever thought this way, take a moment to assess where this assumption is coming from. There's a really great YouTube video called The Beware of the Single Story. And a lot of times when we talk about diversity and we talk about the lack thereof, we're in a bubble of our own. And I can share, for me, growing up, I grew up all over the East Coast, but I went to high school in Worcester. And in my community, like my everyday life, everyone around me was pretty much Latina. I went to pretty diverse school, but most of my friends, obviously my family members, where we went to the grocery store, we went to Santiago's and Compare Foods. And so if I looked and said, I look around and everyone's kind of has the same experience as I do, that is because I'm living in my own bubble. How often do we go beyond what our daily routine is to experience difference? A lot of times, we're in our own communities. A lot of our communities in the US are segregated, frankly. The legacy of segregation and housing in this country has made it so that we do live in bubbles. All of our communities are in bubbles. And so when you think about why there's no diversity, everyone looks like me, where are you going to seek out diversity? Next slide. Oh. And so why we need to focus on diversity as part of our conversations around organizational culture is because we have to reflect the community that we're serving. With greater diversity, the organization is able to access potential resources and support through connections, potential donors, collaborative partners, policymakers, that improves our team's abilities to respond to external influences and the changing environment. It leads to better decision-making. When a nonprofit board, and I'm speaking about boards specifically because that's kind of the topic that y'all wanted to focus on, but it's applicable across the board. When a nonprofit board is facing a major decision, diverse perspectives, so having many different perspectives on your board, makes you more prepared to identify the full range of opportunities as well as the full range of risks. I don't know how often we turn on the TV, we're on social media, and some campaign goes out from like a major corporation and they have big oops moments, right? And we're like, how did that even get through? The people that are making those decisions are oftentimes not having the perspectives, the full range of perspectives that allows them to see those opportunities and risks. If everyone on your team comes from the same experience, similar background, same bubble, how can you identify the full range of the opportunities and risks when you're making decisions? So, and more importantly, teams that are diverse enough, they become really stagnant. You're in the same social circle and you're identifying new team members from that same bubble. So you're constantly facing a challenge of like, oh, who else? Well, you're in your same bubble. Next slide, Liam. And there's the number one mistake that people make when we're talking about diversity is that we're not specific. We don't explain and we don't understand why. It's really important to be introspective and to say, okay, I want more. What do I mean when I say I want more diverse perspectives on our team? Who am I talking about? Why am I afraid to be specific? Especially when talking about race and ethnicity, I see a lot of people squirm in their seats. Myself, sometimes I've been that person before, right? Where you feel like, oh, am I allowed to say it? Can I say it? Be specific and understand why. When we talk about diversity, the number one mistake we make is not just being broad, but using it as a code for what we really mean. If you're thinking about, there's this community by the refuge and we're not engaging folks from that community. So we need diverse perspective. What do you mean? Is it that community is Latina? It's a Black community? It's lower socioeconomic status? Be specific, because that starts to chip away at the systems and the barriers that are in place to understand why you're not engaging with that community, with the community or the folks that you're specifically identifying. If you just say, oh, diverse perspectives, that's so broad that you're not really like identifying specifically what you mean. Next slide. And a lot of times when we use diverse perspectives, I've had this conversation before where there's like, okay, diverse, one person cannot be diverse, right? Diverse is a team of people, it's multiple people within the organization, within the team, within the board. But I feel like when I hear diverse person, I think what we sometimes refer to is this concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality is a framework that helps name the unique experience of a person who can encounter multiple forms of disadvantages, marginalization, discrimination, or oppression simultaneously. So in thinking about intersectionality, we're thinking about the whole person and the whole range of experiences that person has. So I identify as a woman, I'm a cis woman, and I am also part of the Latina diaspora. My ethnicity, I'm Puerto Rican. And, I grew up in a low socioeconomic space, but I have had access to higher ed. All of these identities create a unique experience and a unique perspective. Next slide. And it was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And when we talk about intersectionality, it is a spectrum. It's kind of these overlapping identities. And they influence how we all move through the world, what knowledge we produce, our values and our biases. So they are experiences as these multi-layered, complex, multifaceted individuals also affect how we say, what we think, and what we do, whether it's filtered intentionally or otherwise. And so understanding intersectionality also helps us understand, next slide, the privilege that we have. So I get that a lot of us get uncomfortable like talking about privilege, because you feel like, well, like, I worked hard for what I have. No one is saying you didn't work for whatever you have, but what we're saying is that you did not encounter a challenge because of a particular privilege that you have. And so what's really important here to understand is that we all have privilege in one way or another. And so when we lead from that space of privilege, we provide opportunities to when we understand and we work from that space of like what privileges we have, we understand what power we have, how we the places where we can make the most change. Next slide. I think it's this one. Yeah. And our privilege indicates the level of power and our ability to influence and make decisions that can impact others. So understanding our positionality within this social construct, within intersectionality and privilege, lets us understand what changes we can make and what impact we have. There are various activities that you can do with your team to understand where you lie here and have conversations about that. Like I said earlier in the presentation, when I send this out to all of you, there will be a slide with a list of different activities that you can do to start to understand the intersectionality, the power dynamic, the privilege that a lot of our identities yield. Next slide. And so when we think about systems change, when we think about barriers and addressing the barriers that we're facing, equity is what captures essentially how we address those barriers. So starting from a place of equity, we want to say, we're not saying we're providing the same to all. We're saying we recognize, so when we understand our intersectionalities, we understand privilege, we understand that we don't all start from the same place, and that we have to make not only acknowledge, but make adjustments to those imbalances. Next slide. I'm a visual person, so I try to keep visual cues. This is the most, I think, popular cartoon that we see when we talk about equity. Because equity recognizes, so every person has a different circumstance. So on the left side, we see that every person, you're trying to watch the soccer game or the football game or the baseball game. And so there's different barriers there, right? If you give the same box to every single person, they won't necessarily be able to watch the game. So what you want to do is you want to provide tools, provide resources, provide access to different access depending on where people are in that spectrum. And so this is something that's really popular, but the next slide is something that I found. This particular diagram that depicts equality versus equity is something that I find is the most salient in my life. So I like to, in terms of visual representations, if you need to get across the street, I can just, most places in the US, because that's the way we give them a crosswalk. You get a crosswalk, there you go. Light turns red, you can cross. Everyone gets a crosswalk. When you operate from a perspective of equity, you understand that there is more barriers, circumstances, and conditions that prevent people from being able to cross that street. And so on the right side, you see how changes to our infrastructure, changes to those barriers have been made to make it so that everyone can cross the road or the street, get across the street. So think about where you are in your organization, on your team. What does equity look like? What are those barriers? What do those barriers look like? And what changes you have to make in order to create a space where everyone has access. And we'll talk a little bit more about access in a bit, but I really wanted to also highlight inclusion. So part of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion acronym framework, inclusion requires that we're actively, persistently, and systemically engaging diversity and fostering equity. So when you think about inclusion, you don't think about it as well, everyone's here, everyone's at the table, right? So clearly we have diversity. Diversity is nothing without inclusion, without equity, and without understanding intersectionality and power dynamics. So that means that when you're actually doing inclusion, you're actively, persistently engaging and fostering equity. So you're making sure that everyone has access to those resources. You're making sure everyone feels like they belong. You're making sure everyone has an opportunity to be heard. Now, the biggest thing that I've been seeing happens a lot is that when we talk about inclusion, we're like, well, everyone needs to feel included. When we're talking about inclusion in this framework, we're specifically talking about people who have been historically marginalized, historically oppressed, disinvested communities. We're talking about folks that don't have access, that wouldn't otherwise be included in part of the conversation. And so I get that sometimes we mean well when we say oh, we want to be more inclusive, so we can't forget about the people that we've always hung out with and the people we've always had. You want to be welcoming, I get it. But when we're talking about inclusion, we're not talking about the people that have always had access. We're not talking about the taller person that can already see the fence. That person can already see the game. That person can already see the game. The person who can cross the street is already crossing the street. We're talking specifically about, in the framework of equity, including and making sure that we're actively and systematically engaging people that haven't been historically engaged. Next slide. So at the same time, most recently, maybe we've been talking a lot about, in the past, my experience has been talk about Jedi, and we don't always talk about access or accessibility. And so when we fail to talk about accessibility, we don't talk about a whole group of people that we often leave out. And so a lot of times accessibility is the quality of being reached, or entered, like having access to somewhere, right? But it also refers to being it being easy to obtain or use, and the quality of being easily understood and appreciated. So understanding the barriers that people face when not just having access, not just being able to sit at the table or be at the table, but access to information, access to funding, right? And also, when we talk about accessibility, we're also talking about folks from varying abilities specifically. And so when I've heard us talk about access, at least in our community of conservationists, I've often heard us talk about access as in like access, like public use access. And I want to be clear that in this conversation, when we're specifically talking about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, access, we are specifically talking about being able to have access to that information, but also being thinking about folks who haven't had access before. Again, we're not talking about necessarily like other ways of access that I think sometimes we kind of conflate a little bit. Next slide. Sorry, I'm like clicking my slide. And so I think one of the most important aspects of the JEDI framework is justice. And I think this gets into the action. So once you understand diversity, intersectionality, positionality, privilege, you understand that like equity is providing the resources necessary to differing audiences that are in differing places. Justice is that actively dismantling those barriers to resources. And specifically, when we talk about justice, we want to talk about, next slide, we want to acknowledge that there's been historical discriminatory practices in housing, education, employment, and healthcare. And these have played a key role in the inequities that contribute to greater vulnerability to climate impacts. So in the past, I've heard a lot of like, well, how does this apply to us? Like, what does this mean like for the critters and all this stuff? This is where it applies. When we have historically had systems of oppression that have, next slide, created environmental justice issues where folks have had less access to not just green space, but the same environmental protections and involvement in the policies that shape their communities. So one important thing to keep in mind is, for example, although African Americans make up 13% of the US population, 68% live within 30 miles of coal-fired power plants. 68%. And so these residents are more likely to experience health problems, from heart attacks to birth defects to asthma. And oftentimes, these factors are beyond the control of the particular community. Because why? The economic power, social policies, and political influences differ by place, race, and income as a result of our historical disinvestment and discriminatory practices over time. So what we're gonna, next slide, what we're gonna look at is that despite being the folks that are most affected by some of the environmental issues and natural resource challenges that we have, people of color make up less of the people making the decisions. And so I grabbed this from our EEO report, our 2022 EEO report. And so, I didn't get into the specifics, although I encourage you, and I will share links to all of the data for you all to kind of get familiar. Historically, a lot of our efforts to diversify have benefited mostly white women. So we do start to see a starting to see a shift in gender. We see a little bit more progress there. But specifically for people of color, we're still seeing almost 80% of our agency at the Fish and Wildlife Service is white. So these are mostly the people making the decisions. What's really interesting is that the Fish and Wildlife Service report doesn't really go into like leadership positions. And I'm sure if you wanted some of that data, you just have to ask for it. But next slide. Now, because I'm talking to all of you that are often nonprofit or organizations, friends groups, I wanted to reference the Green 2.0 Transparency Report Card. And the Green 2.0 was previously known as the Green Diversity Initiative. And their goal was to track how we were meeting diversity targets in the environmental sector. So these are not people from some other sector. So all those excuses about like, well, you know, we're a conservation organization. No, these are your colleagues, your peers, the funders, the larger organizations. It is the larger organizations. It is not a lot of the smaller friends or smaller nonprofits. But these are our peers. Next slide. And what we see from the Green Report, and shout out to the professor that worked on doing a lot of this data research or this research and compiling all of the data, is that full-time staff between 2017 and 2022, 21 people of color were added to full-time staff. At the same time, for senior staff, only 2 people of color were added. For more board member, we had 3 people of color added. And for, heads of organization, we had 3 people of color added. So we're seeing a shift, but you can see the discrepancy there where like when we're thinking about full-time staff versus senior staff, who's making those leadership decisions, who's prioritizing, who's making the decisions. We do see that discrepancy there. And that's something that the Green Diversity Initiative, now Green 2.0, has captured in a lot of their data. Now, next slide. I'm showing you this slide because this is our numbers from 2017. So we see that, again, we see that relationship between a significant amount of full-time staff, but not senior staff or board members. So people in the more decision and more executive roles are not necessarily being represented, right? We see that trend over and over again. Now, next slide. So remember the conversation, the numbers that I shared in the 2 slides ago. This is specifically looking at the increase over the past couple of years. So we look at 2017, we were at 19, and we would look at 2022, we're at 33. So that's a pretty significant jump. But when we look at the number, it was just 3 people that were added between 2017 and 2022. Next slide. The reason why I show you this, something happened to percents. The reason why I show you this is because I want to be wary of how we present data. So when I showed you in the first slide, you could see it was just 3 people, 3 senior staff and 3 board members that were added. And the report captures 68 organizations and 20 foundations. So this is the data from the organization. So these are organizations like I think the Nature Conservancy and those kinds of folks that are tracked in that report. And so you see that there's a significant percent change, right? But it was 3 people in senior staff and 3 people are board members. I see it all the time where sometimes when we present data, we present it in a way that looks like, oh yeah, like this, so much progress, so much change, 3 people added. So I want to emphasize that when we're looking at data and we're talking about data, sometimes it's not enough to just look at the numbers. Because remember, when I talked about the framework, diversity is that first, the D, or the first thing I talked about. But equity, inclusion, and justice isn't measured by just this, this data. Next slide. However, we do see a difference in the people of color foundations. So still the people making decisions about money, we're still seeing that trend around like heads of foundations, senior staff, and board members are lagging comparatively speaking to their full-time staff. Next slide. And 100% of the participating nonprofits in the Green 2.0 report committed some kind of resources to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you are seeing the change, but these nonprofits are committing some type of resources to this work. So I think that's important to capture that data. While the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is clearly significantly behind some of the nonprofit sector for many reasons, and we can have I'm sure someone else can have a whole webinar on why that is. But when we're looking at committing resources to this work, can we correlate that maybe there was a change for that? Potentially, according to the report, according to the data provided in the report. Next slide. But the biggest barrier I think that we face when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and access is really our unconscious biases. And sometimes they're called implicit biases. I know some of y'all might be familiar with it, Harvard's implicit bias test, and I will provide resources for kind of dismantling and understanding unconscious bias within your teams. But it's oftentimes informed by stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions. A lot of our unconscious bias goes back to that intersectionality, all the identities. So where are you? What's your positionality with privilege? How, and that oftentimes informs a lot of the stereotypes and that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions. So everyone has everyone has unconscious bias. They're informed by stereotypes, but they can be unlearned. And it's not necessarily a reflection of our core beliefs. What's really important is that a lot of this work requires you to be actively engaged, actively. Next slide. Oh my God. And so when I talk about everyone, when we talk about diversity, this is something that I really like to share, is that a lot of times we want diversity until marginalized people speak truth to power. They call out the harmful structures, and then all of a sudden, we're difficult. So when you get called out, it gets really uncomfortable. And so when we're recruiting folks that are from different perspectives from our own and beyond our community or our bubbles, it can be really uncomfortable to be told, hey, like, guess what? You have a harmful culture. Next slide. And that's where we want to confront the root causes of the issues. So when we transform our culture and our mindset, the power dynamics and the policies, we're addressing some of the root causes of the issue rather than the symptoms. So a lot of times it's like, oh, we just don't have enough diverse perspectives on our board. Well, why not? Next slide. A lot of times it has to do with your organizational culture. And this was from a lot of experiences that I've had, that my colleagues have had conversations. Organizational culture really is the key to inclusion, equity, and justice in our team dynamics. Of course, we still have to change policy, dismantle a lot of things, do a lot of work. But the first step in retaining some of our team members is really talking or working through our organizational culture. And it's more than just like how things are, it's a hidden code of conduct. So it's more the how we do the thing, and it does impact what gets done. So next slide. In the Menti, I want to see if you can describe your organizational culture in one word or in the chat. Stale. So again, I will share these committed, someone said in the chat, I will share some of these in my presentation when I send it back to all of you. Next slide. I don't want to take up too much time because I'm looking at the time. Oh my goodness, where'd time go? And so interpersonal dynamics oftentimes affect our organizational culture. So there's two things that primarily affect our organizational culture. And our interpersonal dynamics refer to the engagement between one or two, between each other, between me and all of you. And our identities and our positionality are critical to shaping team dynamics. So here is where I share a couple notes of two examples of interpersonal dynamics and how they can make or break your team. So I have a close friend, and she recently was hired into an organization, and her supervisor would always call her kiddo. And so this was really uncomfortable because as a 30-plus-year-old person, and a person of color, like being called kiddo feels condescending. So she let her person know, like, hey, you're calling me kiddo. I don't know what you mean by it, but I don't like it. Please stop calling me kiddo. Several occasions. This person, whatever, still calling you kiddo, I mean well. And it wasn't until someone else on the organization that was actually higher up told this person, hey, being calling her kiddo, that's kind of disrespectful, so on and so forth, that this person stopped calling her kiddo. And so when we talk about interpersonal dynamics and how our identities and our positionality affect how we work with each other, that's a perfect example of our hierarchical systems, and how maybe when you intend to be endearing can be actually hurtful in your organizational culture. So if that person has to constantly go to somebody above you to tell them, like, hey, I don't like this, it creates a space where, like, it's not welcoming. You don't feel included. Please never call me kiddo. No one, like, it's condescending, and it reflects the organizational culture of that space. It was very clear that after that instance, right at the beginning, everything that she's experienced since then is extremely hierarchical and extremely tokenizing and condescending. Another example is another colleague was in a meeting, and she had shared with her supervisor before, like, this great idea, and at the meeting she didn't share it, and her supervisor goes, like, hey, like, I noticed you didn't share this at the meeting. What's going on? Are you okay? Like, oh yeah, I just didn't feel like I was allowed to talk. I just didn't know, like, if I was allowed to share that in the meeting because all these directors and all these seemingly important people were in the call. In that instance, that person was like, no, absolutely no. Please share your perspective in the meeting. In fact, I encourage you to do that. That is what that space is for. So there you see a space where, like, this person is paying attention to their colleague, and it's like, you know what? I noticed they had shared this with me. They didn't share in the team. I care about this person. I want this person's voice to be heard. I want them to feel included in the conversation, a sense of belonging on the team. Let me check in and see, like, what's going on, maybe why they didn't share. And at that moment, they realized, like, no, they shaped it. And they said, no, please share let's create a space where people can share and their voice will be heard. Now, this didn't happen in that scenario, but it's also an issue if that person then shares, they always get interrupted, always get talked over, people change the subject. Pay attention to those interpersonal dynamics that happen on the team. Who's talking, who's not talking, why? That's really important to your organizational culture. Next slide. And the next slide, what are some interpersonal dynamics that contribute to your work culture? We'll skip that because we're low on time and I'm really trying to get through this. And then we'll get through the institutional ideologies. So a lot of times, this refers to organizational values and ideas. These are informed by our conservation history and our legacy. So when we talk about institutional ideologies, studies show, or research shows, that prioritizing diversity in recruitment and retention is important stepping stones to addressing the gap. But our organizational values are often at odds with this because we don't like to prioritize the people stuff. We don't like to, in order to be part of this conversation, you have to have a knowledge of, like, really obscure biological terms, for example. These are institutional ideologies that we've carried with us and that prevent us from going beyond our bubble oftentimes. Now, I want to be careful that I'm not saying that, there's not a ton of folks that are in the conservation biology space that are come from diverse communities and are people of color and different abilities and so on and so forth. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that a lot of our institutional ideologies kind of cater for us to be in our own little bubble. A lot of the ways that a lot of groups start, that I've talked to many of you and many of you have shared, is like, around specific recreational activities like birding or something like that. And so when you can't look beyond that, when you don't allow yourself to look beyond that group or that niche, that's an institutional ideology. Your organization has started this way, so you want to cater to people that most likely think and act and do these activities on the side. I'm going to skip the next slide, and I'm going to go through really quickly because I really want to hear from all of you what you do to address some of the organizational culture. You can skip that one too. We want to define diversity. So say what you mean what you say. Next slide. A lot of times, we need to integrate diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. I failed at adding that into the structure, mission, and bottom line of everything we do. We want to identify what we're looking for, do our research, and make it part of what we're doing. So that means sometimes developing a plan with an evaluation and using metrics to identify our needs. But beware, because I'm not telling you to do this analysis paralysis that we often do, where we're like, oh, we need to meticulously write everything down. It has to be perfect, and we can't do any recruitment until the plan is finished. No. The purpose of defining what we mean and like saying what you mean and meaning what you say, is that when you go and do your work, you have a set of metrics, you have a goal, you have clear, it's all on paper. You can revisit that, and you know that your efforts are grounded and that you're tracking your work. You actually are doing the work. The plan is a tool to keep you accountable, which is the next step. And it isn't an opportunity to kind of derail the thing where you need to do this perfect little step-by-step thing. So next slide. Accountability is a big part, and it's specifically for executive senior folks. If you've been on the board forever, if you're the board chair, if you're the team lead, you want to make sure that you're giving these issues attention and you're communicating and prioritizing them. Next slide. And what that looks like is that executive board members model and prioritize JEDIA just as much as everyone else. I'm been part of a lot of teams where like they set up a nice little side group, usually of everyone who doesn't have any power on the team to do anything. And then they handle it, and it never gets done, and you wonder why. That's because the people in the room that have the power to make it an agenda item, to allocate funds, to do what they have to do to prioritize JEDIA, are not actually doing that. And I want to also recognize the limitations of training. Dismantling institutional barriers require active questioning and reframing. So I know many of us do our required DIJ training. Sometimes it's a little webinar, sometimes it's, and that's a great first step, but there's limitations in that. This needs to be embedded into the everyday business that you're doing with your team. Next slide. And most importantly, foster community. I think a lot of times because we think like someone's so different, like, I don't know how to talk to them, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Foster community within your team. There's so much to say about getting to know each other also as people that help dismantle a lot of the unconscious bias and the organizational culture that prevent us from creating safe spaces. If you don't know that maybe that person you just recruited is just naturally a little bit more quiet and requires a little bit more time, then you don't know how to engage them in your conversation, make sure that they're feeling included. And I see a question from the chat. So JEDIA refers to the Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Access framework that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. Next slide. And so mistakes are not bad. Don't take this the wrong way. Mistakes are not bad. We do them and we learn from them, but we have to own the consequences sometimes of our mistakes too. So you made a mistake. Somebody left your board because it was not great. You have to own the mistake. It's, move and like, what did you learn? Let's go. Apply changes to make it not happen again. But these are some common mistakes, and it's like not addressing unconscious bias and intersectionality. I'll provide some tools on like bystander intervention and how you can talk about intersectionality within your team. my favorite. Let's wait till the problem leaves. A lot of times I hear like, oh, there's just one person on the team. One person. Sometimes it's the person also that has all the power, which sucks. Let's just wait till that person retires, leaves, dies. I don't know. And I'm not trying to be morbid or disrespectful. I've even heard, let's wait till people die off. That is not effective. So when we give a lot of power to the dissenter in this work. Like, oh, well, there's those people that, they don't want to do this work. And especially with boards, succession plans are really critical. So of course, this presentation is geared at boards. I know with team dynamics, especially hiring, it gets complicated, but having the perspective of just waiting till the problem leaves is really ineffective. It creates a cycle of oppression, of not inclusion, of just toxicity, especially for folks within marginalized groups on your team. So waiting for your problem to leave is not effective. Next one. And then performative diversity. I work in communications. And I remember when I was in college, we had they took all the people. My college was not very diverse. They took all the people of color, like all of us, and they did a whole photo shoot with us to put all the stuff on the website. Actually, me and my friends joke because if you still go to our university website, you can see some of our pictures. That's performative diversity. So when you're putting out flyers or pictures or posters, and they're extra diverse, and you know what I mean, I'm not talking about representation is important, and that's not what I'm saying that it's not, but when you know what you're doing, when you're like, oh, let's put this person on our stuff, even though it's 1 out of 25 people, and it creates a falsehood for people that are maybe coming to your event, joining your team, that they're expecting something, they get there and it's totally different. And that goes in line with tokenism. Back to the performative diversity. A lot of times when we want diverse people, I already told you that was not the best way to say it, but on our board or on our teams, we take one person and that person also does all the next one, Jedi stuff. They're going to lead all the conversations. They're going to facilitate everything. They know everything. It creates an unfair experience for that person when we also ask underrepresented or marginalized folks to take the lead on Jedi aspects. But it also creates a sense of tokenism where we're not necessarily hearing them on the team when it comes to anything else. I've seen this happen. I was on a team once that all of us were put in oh, let's talk about Jediah stuff. But one of my team members, she was honestly, I don't want to talk about that. Actually, I'm really interested in this very specific conservation project that's happening in my community, and that's why I joined this board. And so it created a space that you're putting that responsibility on the folks that also have the least, oftentimes lesser power to make the change, because to dismantle the systems, because a lot of the dismantling happens with people who have privilege and all of that. So I think that's my last one. I don't know. But I wanted to provide an opportunity for questions. I can stay a little extra. I apologize for going a little over. I didn't want to do my Speedy Gonzalez talking because I think that sucks when I do that. So I hope this was helpful.
So folks, if you have questions for Ashley Ann, you can put them in the chat or just raise your hand. Try to make sure that we get to everybody.
Judy.
Yeah, I just have a question. How can you gently work around people that say, oh, don't mind Joe. He doesn't mean anything by it. That's just how he is. And Joe is a fictional person, by the way.
Yeah, so I think what's really important is understanding that intersectionality and privilege aspect. And I didn't talk a lot about allyship, and I wish I had more time to. But a lot of times when there's this person on our team that is typically someone that is in the privilege area. Speaking from asking someone that has a shared identity with that person to call them out, having those conversations with that person is really critical to start to chip away at the issue that that person is bringing to your team. It is helpful. Like I will say I can't speak for everyone. That's also something I didn't say at the beginning, but I want to emphasize I cannot speak for everyone. But in my experience, it has been helpful to be told so-and-so's on the team and they suck, and you know, they just been on the team for a while. That person does a great job, but like in this avenue, he needs work. It's good for sometimes to give people a heads up because like it's good. But at the same time, use your privilege and to have those conversations with that person, and don't always put it on the onus on the folks of color and the folks from marginalized backgrounds to have those conversations with Joe, fictional Joe, you know? So have those conversations actively with Joe, and push him to learn and to be engaged, and bring him to the webinars, show him the webinars, do activities so he can start to understand his positionality. Lynn.
You did an awesome job, and I appreciate the opportunity to listen to you. I'm so excited about the future of conservation. I wanted to respond to that question, that comment about what do you say to, Joe, quote unquote, fictional Joe, that says, oh, that's just the way he is. Well, if you're not speaking up and, creating that safe space to call him out, you're kind of supporting it. Like, you really need to say, Joe, I know that's what you normally say, but it's harmful because, and I think that's really important. I would encourage everybody to lean in and engage in that conversation and make sure you have that safe space. So it's not like you're attacking Joe. Maybe he doesn't know any better. Maybe he doesn't realize, or maybe he just doesn't realize he's having that impact, right? It's okay to make mistakes, but it's also really important to own up to them. Thank you.
Thanks. David?
Yeah, I'm curious if you know of any case studies that we could use for training purposes within our organization. That I have found in finance and business that case studies are very useful as training devices. Do you know of any that are published that we could use?
I do know of many activities that you can do with your team to start to address and discuss these topics. And I will be including them in the presentation as citations and resources that you can consult in your conversations with your team.
We have used in the past Treliant as a source of online training, and it's been very effective, but it doesn't. A case study is a different thing. It's people put themselves into the position that engenders a really good discussion, and that's sort of what I'm looking for at this point.
Yeah, I can. So as internally at the Fish and Wildlife Service, I've been working with Carmelita Rosner, who's over at John Hines, and as part of the institutional change community of practice, we've been leading conversations that are peer-to-peer learning. So we've been practicing bystander intervention and how to have these conversations when difficult topics come up, or when someone, perhaps like Judy mentioned, says something out of hand or maybe unintentionally, so on and so forth. And I can share some of those scenarios with you. I'm sure that folks would be okay with that. And that's a framework that you can use to have more effective conversations about addressing unconscious bias and incivility on your team.
Thanks, Ashley Ann.
Yeah, of course.
And David, you mentioned, sorry, Jen, David, you mentioned Treliant. Marco, do you want to talk about the availability of that training for folks who haven't been through it? It is helpful. It's a first step, I think.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marco Aguilar. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the National Wildlife Refuge Association, just in case anybody didn't know that. We, as an organization, went through a training, the board and staff, and it was an online platform that folks can do individually at their own pace. and we used an organization, a company called Trailent that's based out of Southern California for that. And they, of all the trainings that I researched and identified and have experienced in past lives, this one was really state of the art in terms of, when I say state of the art, I mean in terms of current topics and current issues facing not just specific communities, but society at large. And it really pushes and asks you specific questions in each segment. There are various trainings that they offer for corporations from OSHA trainings and whatnot, but they also offer diversity training. And in the diversity training, there are 5 modules. And within those 5 modules, there's a series of questions and scenarios that you are presented that you as an individual, what would you respond? What would you do? And there's, there's a right and wrong answer, I think, conceptually, but there's sort of, it really shows you where you lay on the spectrum of what those biases or deficiencies in terms of just not knowing you do. And it's really helpful. And it's not necessarily a got you type of program. It's more of an educational, helpful, this is how you can address these type of questions. Because sometimes I had found, especially when I had first introduced it, I was tasked to research and then introduce a platform for the board when I first was hired about 2.5 years ago. It was not knowing the individuals, not knowing folks in the organization that I had just walked into, but needed to present such a sensitive topic because people are just react or respond to things that are, it's an uncomfortable conversation as it was identified by Ashley Ann in the presentation. It's, how do you get people out of their comfort zone to talk about these things? And this platform allows that to happen because it's not just done individually and then you're one and done. You then you come together as a group to talk about these issues. And some of the things and some folks on our organization were very surprised by it, very surprised by their response or the results for that. Some actually argued with me about that's not what they meant. I was like, okay. But needless to say, it was a helpful thing. And so I say all that to say is that it was very successful and is very informative to our board. We wanted to make it available to friends groups around the country. As an organization, we have already paid for the license or the platform to use. All we need to do if we want to add users is to just sign up, let me know directly, and then you can sign up. And it just because your friends group doesn't have 4, we need to have 4 people because they sell licenses in groups of 4. So if you're an individual with one friends group, but the rest of your friends group members do not want to participate, I can package it together with other groups of other individuals from around the country to get these licenses. So we would purchase the licenses at a very nominal cost of, it's only $27 per license, and they sell them in groups of 4s for that. So we would go. So if I get approached, and I've been approached by one individual, and I constantly go back to that one individual, say I'm still waiting, still need 3 more people because Trailent will not move forward with releasing a new license unless they're in bulks of 4 for that. So it is available. It is and we would be more than happy to make that happen for friends groups or individuals within friend groups to participate in this training.
Yeah, I would just say we've used it at Ding Darling, and the board, the staff, not the volunteers, but the board and the staff, and it was universally respected, appreciated. It is an introduction more than a final exam or course. But it's an important introduction, and it deals with real important issues, and it does it really well. It's a high quality program, I think.
And so, Marco, what do they need to do if they or someone on their board is interested in participating?
Please get in contact with me. Just send me an email. That's the best way.
Can you put your email in the chat for everybody,
sure,
please?
I can do that. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
And then just let me know, and then I can make that start the process.
Thanks, Marco.
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt, Joan, but it seemed like an important place to put that
Yeah.
in.
We were thinking the same thing, Cheryl.
Oh, okay.
Any
So
other?
I
Go
do
ahead,
see a
Ashley.
really important question in the comment. Thank you, Linda. If a friends group has a board that is very homogenous and brings someone on who represents a different community, how does the board give that person a voice without making them the voice for the group they may be seen to represent? I think that finding the middle road is hard to find. So one of the things that I shared with you all early on in the presentation around diversity is being transparent as to why, explaining why and understanding why, the why behind increasing diversity on your board or in your team. And the reason why I pointed to that as a common mistake is because oftentimes we do exactly this. We're saying like, okay, I want to recruit someone from the Latina community. And so I'm going to reach out to Ashley Ann because she's Latina and she's also interested in conservation. And then we're not transparent with that person about what our intentions are. And we're not transparent with ourselves about what our intention is. If you know, if you're operating from a space where you understand that one person doesn't represent the entire community, that's the first step to creating an inclusive environment and making sure that that person doesn't represent the whole community. More importantly, when you're thinking about giving someone a voice, you're not necessarily giving them a voice, you're providing the space for them to participate in your board and in your board meeting. That person has a voice, has their expertise, has their interests, and allowing that person to grow and delve into those interests within their frame of, within what their want is really important. So not recruiting Ashley Ann with the purpose of engaging with the Latina community, and Ashley Ann doesn't want to do that, and then continue to put Ashley Ann and pigeonholing Ashley Ann into those conversations. What that does is exactly what you're saying when you're making them the voice for the group. However, recruiting Ashley Ann because you realize that, hey, you know, I want more differing perspectives on the board, and we have an audience that we really want to engage with, and she lives in that community, or so on and so forth. And then allowing Ashley Ann to engage with the board and engage in the dialogue as she feels she wants and grows. And also doing your own research. A lot of times I get a lot of questions in these scenarios, not right now, I'm not saying it in this webinar, but in spaces that I've been the only person or one of the few that are sometimes easily Googleable, or if you've done some of the work, you would understand some of the system. So when you're recruiting someone from a different community, make sure that your status quo isn't, we haven't done any work. We haven't even had the conversation. We haven't done the training. We haven't done like a intersectionality activity. We haven't had this conversation at all. It is important to make sure that as you're recruiting people, you are also having those conversations on the board. I hope that answers your question. And of course, that's my perspective. I'm sure that there's other folks that may have other tips on making sure folks are not the representative for the community that they're a part of.
So we are a few minutes over, and I'm not seeing any other questions or hands raised. Ashley Ann, it sounds like we probably need to have a 2.0 version of this at some time in the future to talk about the next steps and where we go once we've gotten the start, hopefully, where we go from there.
Yeah, of course. And also, you're all, more than welcome to reach out if you have any specific questions. Linda is also a great resource to reach out to from the service perspective. And I will be sharing the presentation with all of you and all of the resources, as well as any scenarios and case studies.
And I see one more hand at this point. Polly, do you have a question or a comment?
I just wanted, well, to thank Ashley Ann, of course, but also to say that when we talk about case studies, I was thinking about the iceberg slide, and one place we can get started is getting to know each other on our board. So you don't know by looking at a board member, their spouse could be of a different religion, a different race, a different sexual orientation. So I think it's important to use the resources we have and educate ourselves before we just count on someone else to explain their point of view or what they quote unquote need. So that was just a suggestion.
Thanks, Polly. Before we sign off, I just want to mention that our next webinar is going to be on January 17th. And the topic for that webinar is going to be about internships. What do friends need to consider and think about as they're moving forward with any sort of internship program? So that is January of 2024. Any other comments, questions? All right. Well, I want to thank Ashley Ann for this presentation. It was fantastic. There is so much to think about, and thank all of you for participating in it. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season.